Okay, Susan, ready? I'd like to reconvene the Board of Supervisors, and we're going to move to item 25. Madam Clerk?
So the report of closed session at lunchtime. Item 1, pursuant to Government Code Section 54957A, conference with counsel regarding matters posing a threat to the security of public buildings, essential public services, or the public's right of access to public services or facilities. There was no reportable action taken.
I need to thank the clerk because it's so unusual for us to go into closed session during a board meeting, and I did forget that, so thank you. Now we're back on target. Could you please go to item 25?
Absolutely. Item 25 is from the Administrative Office to receive a presentation and update on the implementation of the commercial cannabis program and direct staff regarding proposed policy changes and ordinance amendments.
All right, this is how I want to manage this section. I am going to be asking Mr. Turner to please do his total presentation. I'll bring it back to the board for any questions or comments at that time. I will then open it up for public comment. The 5-minute waiting period does not hold till after we receive what I assume will be many public comments. And then after the last one, then I might wait 5 minutes and I will close public comment and bring it back to the board to start maybe giving some direction to staff. Okay. Mr. Turner, could you please proceed?
Good afternoon, Board. I'm Ethan Turner. I'm the Interim Director of the Division of Cannabis Control. I'll be doing a presentation this afternoon that covers the status of the program, provides you with a brief explanation of the process that applicants have to go through. So if there's some terminology at the beginning that you don't understand when I'm presenting it out, it'll be clarified as I talk about the application process. Following that, I'll present a variety of policy questions. The way the PowerPoint is set up, policy questions are posed throughout the presentation, but as the chair indicated, we're going to answer those questions at the end of the meeting. So with that, I'll begin. To date, we've received 101 pre-applications. Of those, 36 have come in, paid their fees, submitted their applications, their property diagrams, the regulatory compliance questionnaires, and paid their fees. The total fees we've received to date is $452,196. There was going to be several more fees paid this week, but I canceled the appointments due to the coronavirus situation, and staff is currently working on ways to work around the current situation and continue to serve the needs of our applicants. The total footprint of the program currently is we've got 11,250 square feet of indoor cultivation under the conditionally authorized applications, and 3.84 acres of mixed light cultivation and 19.1 acres of outdoor cultivation. And these are the ones that are conditionally authorized. I think these are the individuals that have a high probability of making it to begin cultivation this season. And that constitutes those that have paid the fee so far. And this is a map that our GIS department created. It sort of shows the distribution of the cultivation sites. This is all 101 right now, and a couple of these have withdrawn, I think about 8 of them, but that's about what the industry looks like across the county. And I was going to do an interactive presentation on how our GIS layers work, but I don't think we're really going to have time. The application process has 4 stages. There's the initial eligibility stage. That's when we receive a pre-application. There's the application submittal and review stage. There's the local permit issuance. And then finally, the last stage is permit validation, and that's when cultivators can put plants in the ground and begin their cannabis business operations. The initial pre-application phase, the eligibility stage, has 2 components. The first component is applicant eligibility. They have to be have been in the former UO program and have been in good standing and did not withdraw their application or be denied. And they have to have submitted a temporary license application to the state before June of 2018. And if they did not receive that application, they had to have been denied only because of the implementation of the ban ordinance. There was a period during the spring of 2018 when applicants submitted temporary applications to the Department of Food and Agriculture, and those applications were summarily denied, and we were not contacted for questions about local authorization because CDFA erroneously believed that the ban was already in effect. And we were able to get the information on those applicants from CDFA so we can ascertain which applicants those are. And that kept us within the total applicant pool of around 200, about 195 to 200. The second part of the applicant eligibility phase is parcel eligibility. In 17.955050D, there is a chart which shows which parcels are eligible for which kinds of license types. And outdoor cultivation, mixed light cultivation, and processing permits, which we're going to talk about some more, are only allowed in A1, AP, GF, and U, whereas commercial indoor cultivation can occur in the M zones. And there is a unique type of cultivation that can happen in conjunction with dispensaries that are operating under 17.91 that can be in the CP zones. And there's only 4 of those. The second stage is application review and submittal. That's when an applicant has made it through the pre-application stage. Thank you, Susan. And has demonstrated that their parcel is suitable and that they are eligible for the program. We take in their application, accept their fee, and review with them their project description and their premises diagram. And we issue a letter of conditional authorization, which is one of the 2 prerequisites for being able to apply for a state license. And we initiate a CEQA checklist, which I'll talk about more in a minute. We also initiate a business license application, and then we begin application review. And that's when the application starts to go through the various land use departments for the approvals that are necessary to operate a cannabis cultivation business. This is a screenshot of part of the letter of conditional authorization that outlines the 2 pieces that are needed for an applicant to be eligible for a provisional license from the state. And the first is local authorization, and the second is demonstrating that CEQA compliance is either underway or has been completed. And that's the purpose of the CEQA checklist. And as we implemented this program, the planning director, the chief administrative officer, and I worked with CDFA lawyers, CEQA consultants, and CDFA staff to come to an agreement whereby our applicants could submit a CEQA checklist to CDFA to demonstrate that CEQA compliance was underway. And what that checklist consists of is the mitigation measures that are identified in our EIR and the operating restrictions that are in our zoning ordinance for commercial cannabis cultivation. When someone comes in for their initial application meeting, we initiate that checklist. We check off the boxes that only have to do with parcel eligibility and applicant eligibility. And when they've finished all of the land use approvals, we sign it off before they get their business license stamp from the planning department. And at that point, CEQA compliance is complete and they're eligible for an annual license. And permit issuance is when they're done with just the local component. I've listed here some of the many requirements that have to be satisfied before we can issue a permit based on our local standards. There's some of the mitigation measures are listed up there, and there's way too many requirements to list. And to demonstrate how convoluted and complicated the process is, I have a little chart here. I created this chart when we were working on our fee study so that I could wrap my own head around the fee-funded tasks that are involved in administering this program. For those who have downloaded this PowerPoint, which is available on our website right now, if anyone wants to go to Calaveras Cannabis, our main webpage, this whole PowerPoint can be downloaded and you can follow us along from home. And applicants or anyone who's interested can review that at their leisure to look at all the stages that are involved. The application begins with submittal to us, the Division of Cannabis Control, and if necessary, it goes to planning, if an AUP or CUP is required. And at that point, that's when we issue the letter of conditional authorization, and that's when the state process begins. And that's what these green boxes and symbols indicate. And that's the state process that goes around to validation. And then the local process goes through all these land use departments, including the fire districts, which coordinate with the building director to make sure that the requirements under the fire code and the public resources code are satisfied. And fire code compliance can be complicated, particularly in the rural sections of the county where there's limited infrastructure and roads and driveways that don't necessarily meet the requirements of 4290. And I put this up here to show that there's 9 fire districts in the county. I believe I'm correct in saying that only 3 of them have fire marshals, which are the designated officials who are in charge of implementing the fire code. The remainder work with 4. I've just been corrected by Supervisor Mills. 4 of them have fire marshals. The remainder work with the building department to make sure that the fire code is properly implemented as businesses are approved. The final stage is permit validation, and that occurs when we've received evidence of state licensure and the building department has signed off on the site. They've done their site inspection, indicated that all requirements of the building code and fire code are satisfied. The local permit is issued, and we've received either a provisional or annual license from the state. At that point, the permit is validated, and an applicant can proceed with cultivation. This process is really complicated, so we held a workshop on March 9th that helps people get through this, and the entire workshop can be viewed on YouTube. Our local cable access people edited the video for us and put it up there. That's the link, but you can also just Google Calaveras County Cannabis Regulatory Workshop and it'll come up. Pictured there is Adam Fries, our local Cal Fire Forester, who presented on clearing practices and forest management plans and timber harvest plans that are sometimes required to prepare a site for agricultural activity. And you can see down in the corner, there's a video that's 1 hour and 42 minutes long. That's Doug Oliver, our building director, talking about building code compliance. Okay, in our staffing, I wanted to report out on that. I think our status can be fairly characterized as understaffed. That's partly my fault, and because I tried to hire 2 different people, and for various reasons they couldn't work out. But right now it's just me, Ben Diamond, and Karen Osborne, who's fortunately going to stay with us for a little longer as she's decided to postpone her move, so we'll have her for a little longer, which is good. But Ben Diamond does the lion's share of the processing work and does all the grunt work associated with this program. My proposed staffing levels are a director, which I recommend should be a lawyer for at least through implementation, because there's going to be ordinance drafting, there's going to be administrative appeals, and potentially litigation stemming out of all of these type of activities, as well as drafting policies, forms, and implementing procedures. So at least through the implementation stage, I think that whoever it is that replaces me ought to be a lawyer. There's an assistant. I think there should be an assistant or deputy director who's at a senior analyst level that has planning department experience, has experience running administrative appeals, and acting as a witness and a custodian of records. An analyst and an admin assistant or an office tech. I think with those 4 people, you could run this program. And it seems top heavy, but it's because many of the instrumentalities of this program are operated by the various other land use departments, building, planning, and environmental health, and ag. Okay, when we had to reschedule this meeting as a consequence of the coronavirus, I sent out an email to all the applicants, and I also put on the agenda item that we could receive input from members of the public and from the board to talk about policy ideas that relate to this program. And so I'm going to present on some of the things that I've heard, and I'm trying to integrate as many of the comments as I possibly could into a few categories, which they all largely fit into. Some of the ideas are not good, some of them are, and we'll go through them. As we go through each policy question, I concluded each section with the policy questions that will be faced by the board. And as the chair directed, we will save all those questions for the end. But that you could at least be thinking about them, and members of the public who wish to comment can be thinking about them as we go through it. So the changes that are going to be proposed today could be classified as minor changes. They might just be able to be quick cleanup and changes that don't require a lot of subsequent environmental review, but other ones will require major review depending on what the board decides to do. And I've worked closely with the planning director last week and up through this morning, and I think it's extremely important that the planning director be involved in all zoning decisions. And when we're through with this and we've gotten direction, I'll work closely with Peter until for as long as I'm here, and with our outside counsel who will help us with CEQA issues, and we'll determine how to best to implement the board's policy direction that we received today. Okay, one of the comments that I've received, and it's come directly from cultivators and also through board members from cultivators, there's an idea that we could somehow give people a cultivation license locally, even if the state license has not been issued. And it was brought to my attention that Lake County does have a provision in their ordinance that allows, that seems to allow for this. But it does have caveats. It says that all other applicable state requirements have been satisfied. And then it has a language that says that the cultivation shall be deemed authorized by the county. And then at the bottom it says, nothing in this provision is intended in any way to supplant or be contrary to the licensing requirements of the state. And I think it implicitly is. So my recommendation on this topic is no change, because state reviews are extremely important. Review by Fish and Wildlife, the State Water Resources Control Board, are critical to us knowing that the best practices are in place at a cultivation site. And when those processes are complete, that's when the science review is done by CDFA, and a local, and a state license, provisional or otherwise, can be issued. Additionally, CDFA does Interpol, FBI, and Cal DOJ background checks on all owners. So without a state license being issued, we don't know that these reviews have been completed, and so it's better not to think about letting people cultivate until they've got a state license. And also, once a person has begun cultivation, if we find out they're subsequently in violation of the rules, we're very likely to have administrative appeals and potentially litigation in order to get them to stop, like we experienced over and over and over and over again in the UL. And then finally, I think that such local authorization would be facially illegal. The Business Professions Code 26032 exempts from prosecution for violation of the Controlled Substances Act, the California Controlled Substances Act, people who have state licenses. So even if we did such a local ordinance that allowed for people to cultivate without having a state license, there would be nothing to stop the sheriff from arresting them and the district attorney from prosecuting them and having their assets forfeited. So I don't think we should allow people to do it. And so that's the policy question. Is there any remaining interest after everything I've said in allowing people to cultivate should there be delays in processing of state licenses? And we'll answer that question at the end. Okay, another public comment that I hear over and over is cannabis is an ag product and cannabis cultivation is an agricultural operation. There are people who think that that such a designation somehow exempts businesses from requirements under the building code, fire code, or public resources code, or from things like payment of rent fees. That's not the case. Zoning and land use designations do not equal occupancy. The building and fire code are in their own universe, totally separate from any designations made in zoning codes or any designation of activities or products as agricultural in nature. And to point that out, I have here the definition from the building code itself that talks about what an ag structure is. And the designation that the building director makes about what a building's use is and what its occupancy has to do with the nature of the activity that goes on in there, the principal or primary nature of the activity that's going on in there. And you'll see clearly in this definition that it shall not be a place of human habitation or a place of employment, even where agricultural products are processed, treated, or packaged. So designating it as a agricultural activity will not help with any of those requirements or restrictions. It won't exempt people from rim fees, nor from fire access requirements under the Public Resources Code, or from fire flow requirements. I mean, so long as you have a structure on your property that's not an agricultural structure, i.e. there's people working in it. So that begs the question, why does the county bother to say in our ordinance that cannabis will not be designated an agricultural operation? And there's two reasons for that. This is the language in the ordinance that speaks to that. No cannabis cultivation shall be deemed an agricultural operations for the purposes of Title 14 and 15, nor shall it be designated as such for Title 17, and it goes on. And then the other provision that relates to agricultural activities is subdivision E of the same section that says that cannabis cultivation shall not be in and of itself the basis for a Williamson Act contract. Now, the Williamson Act contract business is not something I'm going to cover. That's, if the board wants to talk about it, we can. But the policy reasons behind subdivision D are twofold. And one is agricultural operations are exempt from grading permit requirements. In Title 14, 15, and 17, we have sections that define an agricultural operation as land leveling for the purposes of agricultural activities, and Title 15 expressly exempts agricultural activities, so grading, earthwork activities carried out in conjunction with or associated with, related to, or in support of an agricultural operation are exempt from grading. Now, that's not a problem with the cannabis ordinance, that's a problem with Title 15. And I just think it's personally a bad policy because here is an example of land leveling for an agricultural activity that is done without a permit. If those were blueberry bushes in those pots, this would be perfectly legit under Calaveras County's code. And so I think the real solution is to fix Title 15, 14, and 17 with in that regard, if you wish to characterize cannabis as an agricultural activity. There's another example that would, by the way, both of these were grow sites registered under the UL. This one, you can't really see it well in this picture, but this drop off here is about 16 feet. And down here is Salamander Creek, and all this washed into the creek. Subsequently, after the grow was abandoned. So this is a problem with our ag ordinance, and that's the policy reason behind exempting cannabis cultivation from being characterized as an ag operation, because we don't think it should be exempt from permit requirements. These things would not happen if they had been subject to a permit requirement. And these cultivators felt that they were agriculture operations and they could just go ahead and grade. So my recommendation, if the board does want to characterize cannabis as an ag activity, would be to go ahead and fix these provisions of the county code. And if the board wanted to characterize cannabis as an ag operation without fixing these, you could do it with some language that I'll show you in a minute. So that's the first reason, grading. If it's an ag operation, it's exempt from grading permits. And I think that's just a bad policy. So that's why we took the steps to characterize it as a non-agricultural operation for the purpose of that section. The second reason is the right to farm provisions in our ordinance. If you're an agricultural operation, you have the right to carry out your activities, and it shall not be a nuisance, public or private, by virtue of it being an agricultural operation. And now, this ordinance does go on to say that if the agricultural activity is undertaken contrary to local ordinances, laws, and regulations, then it can be a public nuisance or a private nuisance. So there is some protection in there. But the concern of staff when we were writing that section of the ordinance was that someone would make right-to-farm claims about their operation, which would otherwise be a nuisance in violation of the county code. So those are the two reasons. And so if the board is interested in addressing the concerns that some applicants have and other members of the public have of characterizing cannabis as an ag operation and cannabis as an ag product, you could make the changes in Title 14, 15, and 17 and/or change the language in 030 to make sure that no one thinks that they're exempt from a grading permit when they're doing a cannabis cultivation operation. And then the final sentence here, which really is echoed in section 17.95040 already, but you can put it in here just to fully cover your bases, just to make sure that cannabis cultivation, whether or not it's an ag product in violation of this statute or this ordinance, would be a public nuisance that'd be enforceable by the county or by a private right of action. So the policy questions that come out of this are, does the board want to consider designating cannabis as an ag operation? And then if it does, would it want to change Title 14, 15, and 17 to make sure that the policy concerns that staff had when addressing that provision are taken care of, or add language in 17.95 to make sure those two bases are covered. So the point of all this is that if people want it to be an ag product and an ag operation, that's fine. I just want the board to be cognizant of those two policy reasons as to why it currently isn't designated as such when it makes its decisions about doing that or not doing that. The other comments that I've been receiving, and this is actually a very popular one because it relates to the functionality of our ordinance. When we put the ordinance together, it was important to me and other staff members that we put in the self-distribution transport-only provision to allow, because we knew that it'd be difficult to have processing facilities in the rural areas of the county. And it is. We put that in there, but this is a kind of a forehead slapping moment for me after the fact. We didn't put processing licenses anywhere but in the ag zones. So what the proposal is expanding the ability to put processing licenses and processing facilities in M zones where the county has existing structures that are suitable for F1 type occupancies, which are light industrial, light factory type occupancies, which processing is, because you have a bunch of people in a room, packaging, processing, handling products. So we need structures that have access to infrastructure that can meet fire flow requirements, meet fire code requirements, that are AD accessible, and meet OSHA requirements. And then when it comes to that, we also didn't do anything about different types of eligibility for a processor license. You have to be eligible, and as we said at the beginning, under the pre-application phase, to apply for a processor license. Growers who want to invest in processing licenses don't want to burn or use up a right to apply, because a right to apply can be worth $40,000 to $100,000, and they don't want to use it up to have to invest in a processor facility. Okay, well, this is a quote from an email that I got. Processing your own product on your own farm shouldn't be a problem, but it is. Because if you're up in the A1, U, or AP zones, you're not going to be able to meet minimum fire flow requirements. The structures aren't going to meet the fire code requirements. Your driveway is going to have to be less than a 16% grade. It's going to have aggregate that can handle a 40,000-pound fire truck. So you really can't have a processing facility in many of the places where the ordinance as written would require a processing facility to be. Processor licenses under state law are just that. They're only for processing. It's a cultivation site. It's a license issued by CDFA, but it's only for trimming, drying, curing, grading, packaging, or labeling cannabis on a non-cannabis manufactured products. And non-cannabis manufactured products are usually trim and leaves that are discarded when you're selling for buds. An application fee for a processor license from the state is $1,000, and an annual license fee for a processor license is $9,370. So it's a pretty onerous process. You still have to go through all the CEQA requirements and would have to otherwise meet all the requirements of state law. As I said, under the current ordinance, processor licenses are restricted to A1, AP, and GF and U zones, which in most cases are not suitable for such activities, and there's very few structures that already exist in those zones that would work for processing facilities. And additionally, a person has to not only burn their right to apply, which can be worth, I've seen contracts for $40,000 and $100,000, and spend an additional $12,561 to start a processor facility. So it has made a major problem for the industry to succeed here. Because we will have a lot of cultivators and nowhere to process it. So this is a flaw in the design of the program, and the recommendation is to amend the ordinance to allow for separate processor permits and to allow them in M zones. And we could either allow anyone to apply for a processor license, and this is a policy call for the board, or restrict it to those who would otherwise be eligible under 17.95050D1, which is you had a license under the UO and you had a temporary license under the state. And I wrote some sample text on how that would work. This would fit right under the self-distribution transport-only license provisions. There would be minimal local requirements and a separate smaller fee for registering or applying for a processor license. And the first paragraph that I have up here restricts eligibility to apply for those license types to those who would otherwise be eligible for cultivation licenses. And the board can either have language like that or not. So the policy questions are, one, do you direct us to allow processing in M zones? And do you want to restrict eligibility to processor licenses to just those who have cultivation licenses? Or do you want to open up the ability to get a processor license to anyone who wants to invest the money and time and effort to start a business like that here? So those are the policy questions which we'll return to at the end of the program here. Separation requirements. This is tied to the processor license and also to the indoor cultivation requirements. Under the UO, sensitive use restrictions only applied to outdoor and mixed light cultivators. Under the new ordinance, the separation requirements are applied to all cultivation types, including indoor cultivators, and then would by default also be applied to processors. State law requires that, which has roughly the same sensitive uses that we do, that a cannabis cultivation premises or commercial cannabis operation be at least 600 feet away from a sensitive use. Our ordinance says 600 feet away from the property line or 1,000 feet away from the premises, whichever is greater. And the property line one, 600 feet from the property line, can actually result in massive setbacks depending on the size of the parcel, which would render otherwise eligible locations that would be suitable for processing ineligible. This is the state law, Business Professions Code 26054. It has a 600-foot radius and has only a few sensitive uses. We have more. This has just schools and the daycare centers. And ours include a park, a school, a daycare center, a youth center, and actually youth centers are in the state law too, and county libraries and branches. And we also have scenic highways. And there's, in Calaveras County, there's a section of Highway 4 that is a scenic highway that we'd have to have setbacks from. And as I indicated, ours is whichever is greater between the 600 feet from the parcel or 1,000 feet from the premises. And as I indicated, that can result in very large setbacks, making large swaths of otherwise suitable buildings ineligible for indoor cultivation or processing. So the sample proposed ordinance change would just make it so that outdoor cultivators and mixed light cultivators had to be set back. And then I added language here that said an indoor cultivation or processing facility that wouldn't have the setback requirements that are required under 090I or the separation requirements that are under 090Q would have to be filtered and prevent any odor from coming out. And we could also add language to make sure that the commercial cannabis activities are not visible from any public right-of-way or from the sensitive use. So those are the policy questions on that topic. Direct staff to reduce separation requirements to state standards for indoor cultivators and processors, and if so, what kind of restrictions do you want to impose on those activities? Odor control, make sure that none of it's visible from outside, whatever the board dictates. The next item is well testing permits. And well testing permit requirements, and the which is the annual testing and the prerequisite testing that you have to do before you can get your local permit. And what I have here is an image of the water supply levels in Calaveras County. It's part of a GIS program, and interestingly, the cultivation is the bulk of it is actually in this area. There's a few of it. A little bit of it down here and a little bit up that way, but it happens to actually coincide with moderate to high levels of groundwater, and I just thought that was interesting. The well testing requirements have been subject to complaints because they're onerous and expensive, because qualified professionals are in short supply, and the annual pump test requirements is not feasible as drafted. Right now, the annual well pump test is what it is. You have to do a 24-hour pump test to demonstrate your ability to water the amount of plants that you have. And there's actually one typo in here. This should have been a hydrogeologist, not a registered geologist. And that would be part of a small cleanup. And there's about 4 service providers in our local area, in the Tri-County area, who can do this. But there's a lot of people that are trying to get it done. And it's getting done. They're having the well pump test done, and I think people are not having trouble lining up the number of contractors. So I don't think that's a real impediment to the success of the program. But the annual well test requirement requires that it be tested every year for 5 years, and as written, it says that it has to be done during the month of September. Now, if there's 150 grow sites, or 130, or even only 100, it's not feasible to get the 4 service providers that we have in the Tri-County area to be able to do that many well pump tests in 1 month. So what I would recommend is that the 24-hour well pump test be left in place because it's a mitigation measure under the EIR. And if it's not going to be left in place, then it'd be part of a major overhaul type revision that's subject to subsequent environmental review. So I would just leave that in place for practical reasons and because it's not a bad idea, really. And the second one is I would extend the annual well pump test requirement for 90 days instead of 30 days. And I talked to 2 different hydrogeologists about this, and they felt that so long as the test is done before it starts raining, you're going to get an actual readout on your use to see if you're drawing down the water supply for that very cultivation area. So the proposed change would be minor. This is to the operating restriction section. It would just delete the in the month of September section and have the well pump tests conducted annually occur between July 31st and October 31st, which would allow the 100 or 150 well pump tests to occur during a 90-day period, which seems more practicable than having it done within a 30-day period. So those are the policy questions. Obviously, there's advocates for entirely removing the well pump test requirement. As indicated, that would require an addendum, supplemental EIR, or worse. And by worse, I mean more time-consuming and costly. As far as consultants and outside counsel. And then the other one is more straightforward, and I think non-controversial, is increasing the annual well pump test period from 30 days to 90 days. Site remediation requirement. The site remediation requirement deadline of February 9th, 2020 came from the ban ordinance, because the ban ordinance required remediation to occur within 2 years. But that deadline has passed, and while I wholeheartedly am behind requiring remediation, I think this deadline will actually prevent remediation from occurring, because there's sites that would otherwise be eligible to produce a right to apply, that since the February 9th deadline has passed, will be abandoned and left unremediated. So I think we encourage cultivators to continue with remediation by removing that deadline. So this deadline causes the loss of prospective cultivation sites that would otherwise be purchased by investors, and they'll be abandoned and unremediated. And then this actually brings back bad memories from the UO appeal periods, where we always had to figure out what the condition of the property looked like on May 10th. This time, we're going to be trying to figure out what the property looked like on February 9th or before, as we deal with appeals. And I'd rather just have an inspector go out there and find whether or not a site has been remediated than argue about what did or did not happen in the past. So I think this is, there's obviously, this is a policy call of the board. There's some of the public comments that I saw were that, look, they didn't follow the rules, we shouldn't let them get away with that. And that's true. There's some people didn't follow the rules, but in many cases, the people who didn't follow the rules no longer own the properties, and have sold their right to apply to a third-party investor who is more than happy to clean up that site. And I'd like to see it cleaned up. So the site remediation requirement would just be one change. It would just delete the by the February 9th deadline of 2020. Section 17.95130 is actually the longest section in the ordinance that talks about all of the requirements for site remediation that exist. And 17.95070G is the one that requires, as a prerequisite to permit issuance, that the former site associated with the right to apply has been remediated. So it's just scrapping one sentence, and I think it would result in more environmental remediation and shoring up of sites that are currently sitting abandoned with unpermitted grading or open grading permits, or that have junk and debris and smart pots strewn all over the place. So the policy question on this one is, does the board wish to remove the deadline for remediation? I would advocate for this one because I think it would result in more remediation. Okay, background clearance badges. That's the next topic of discussion for us. The update on that score is that we have within the CAO's office a custodian of records, and in my office a custodian of records that have been background checked by the DOJ. We have our ORI number, so we can now have live scan forms that we give out, and people have taken them and they go up to the sheriff's office or to some other live scan provider and get their live scan done. However, all live scan vendors are closed down right now with the coronavirus, so no one can do their background checks. Now, the background check requirement has to do with three components of the ordinance. It has to do with eligibility. In order to get a local permit, you have to have the owners get background checked. And as a prerequisite to permit issuance, I need to see copies of your CBCD, which our office also issues. And then there's an operating restriction that all owners and workers have to, at all times, be badged if they're going to be on cannabis cultivation sites. So it's fully integrated in the program. Now, it requires owners and workers to get backgrounded under our local program. And we have our own definition of owner that is slightly more expansive than that of the state. It generally tracks the state definition, but adds trustees because there's properties in the county, many of them that are owned by trusts. whether they're family trusts or business trusts. But other than that, it's pretty much the same. It's essentially, there's two tests that can be applied generally to both local and state law for determining whether or not an individual is an owner. The first is management and control. If you exercise management control over the company or supervise people at the site, you're an owner, even if you really don't have an ownership interest. And that also includes officers of corporations, even if it's more than one corporation that owns a business entity, as well as board of directors from those corporations. And anyone who has a 20% interest or more in a cannabis business. And as a consequence of that broad and searching definition of owner, there's many people who have a piece of local cannabis businesses who have never been to Calaveras County and will never come to Calaveras County, except for they will fly here to have their picture taken in my department to get a CBCB. So it's onerous for some businesses because again, it doesn't serve, in those cases, it doesn't serve the policy interest behind the requirement. Now, our local background check review is broader and has more penalties, more violations than does the state set of backgrounds check requirements. The state only has felony convictions of a certain category. We included felony and misdemeanor convictions for many categories of crimes, but in large part, the scope of presumptively disqualifying offenses do track the states, but ours is more searching. And here's ours. The ones in red are ones that are not presumptively disqualifying under the state law. So if the board, and the policy question that's coming up is, do we want to continue to require owners to go through the CBCB process? And owners, when they apply for a CDFA license, have to get an Interpol, FBI, and Cal DOJ background check. So our process is just Cal DOJ, so it's less, it's a much less in-depth process. So it's duplicative of state background checks, except with respect to these offenses. This is the only thing we look for that the state, the FBI, and Interpol background checks don't look for. These are ones that were specifically requested by the sheriff and the district attorney during the drafting of this. Some of them are interfering with the duties of a police officer and in varying degrees of resisting arrest, engaging in activities that result in high-speed chases, additional firearms violations, and others. So the question really is, do owners have to go through the CBCB test when they're going to have to do the CDFA background check anyway, and in many cases when owners are never going to come here? I actually am behind this policy change. I think we should exempt owners from the CBCB requirement. The principal concerns that I think the public have, and I'm not going to speak for the sheriff, but I think I'm accurate in saying that he's listening so he can correct me. The big concern was workers. So you could get rid of the owner requirement. They're getting their FBI, Interpol, and state background check done by CDFA, and many of them aren't going to ever come here. And right now, we can't issue permits because of the live scan vendors are all closed down because of the coronavirus. So the recommendation is remove background requirements for owners because it's duplicative of the process and less searching than the process required of CDFA, and then many owners won't come here. And then finally, the current pressing problem is that we can't do the background checks at all because the coronavirus is closing down the background check sites. So what that would look like would be a deletion of the eligibility requirement and the permit prerequisite requirement, and a deletion of owners from the operating restriction sections of the ordinance. Workers would still be required. Now the policy questions are rescind all of Chapter 9.22, which is a sweeping, perhaps controversial move, then or direct staff to remove the requirement for owners, or the most minor change would be to suspend the CBCB requirement temporarily for the issuance of local permits. In my view, that could be done, but I really think the owners are getting through adequate background check from the state. And I've heard from growers that the background checks from the state caught offenses, some of which occurred while they were minors, that were not caught during the background checks done during the UL period. So I think it's a very probing, very searching background check that should assure us that the owners that are applying for the program are, to the extent possible, not criminals. Or, yeah. So those are the policy questions related to the 9.22 owners and background checks. The next section is a revision of Measure C. And I wanted to go over for context what the current ordinance says, what state law is, and what the current ordinance now looks like as a consequence of implementation of the track and trace program. Right now, because the track and trace program is in place, we have moved from the $2 per square foot for mixed light and outdoor cultivation and $5 per square foot for outdoor cultivation to $45 per pound of dry weight flower and $10 per pound of dry weight trim for outdoor and mixed light cultivators, $70 per pound for dry weight flower, and $15 per dry weight trim for, that should say, indoor cultivators. And then there's also a 7% gross proceeds tax on manufacturing of cultivated cannabis, and 7% gross proceeds tax on medical or legal cannabis storefronts, collectives, and storefronts. I don't know if that typo is my fault or if that's actually in Measure C. Could be in Measure C. In addition to these locally imposed taxes, cannabis flower for outdoor is $154 per pound for the state and $45 per pound for leaves. We don't use the same terminology as the state in our local ordinance. And then there's also a category that we do not have in Measure C, and I think this is the category that requires us to revisit Measure C, is the fresh cannabis plant. Many outdoor cultivators cut down their cannabis plants and sell them directly to a manufacturer for what's called juicing. I don't know if that's a scientific term, but that's the term that I hear people using. Under our tax ordinance, a cultivator could grow an acre of cannabis and pay zero in taxes because they could just sell the fresh plants to a manufacturer, because we tax on dry weight trim and dry weight flower. So this is a glaring and massive loophole in our tax ordinance that must be fixed. And since we're fixing it, there's a bunch of other things I'd like to fix. I'd like to change it to the terminology that used by the state, so there's conformity between our local tax ordinance and state tax ordinances, or state tax statutes. And I would like to return to a tax based on canopy. And I'm behind that, and we'll go over the cost difference to the county and the income difference that results from such a change. And I've met with Barbara Sullivan, the tax collector, on this. She and I have been through a lot together on Measure C because we had all of our tax appeals together and had many opportunities to discuss the contents of this ordinance and the things that we'd like to see change in it. And over the past few months, I've talked extensively with her and looked at other tax ordinances in other jurisdictions, and we've come to an agreement on a lot of different changes that we'd both like to see. I also have met with the auditor and corresponded with the assessor on the topic too, because there's certain collection measures that can be done in her office. And finally, I'd like to just do a general cleanup. There's a number of things in the policies and procedures and appeal processes that have resulted in litigation and that are confusing for people who are trying to be taxpayers. In order to try and do a side-by-side comparison of a canopy tax versus a per pound tax, I looked around for different studies that had estimated production based on area. The one study I found was done by CDFA in 2017 when the MMRSA, the original Commercial Medical Ordinance, came out. And I put a link to it. And if you go and look in it, it actually does it by per square foot. And so I had to do some algebra to get to the per acre amounts, but hopefully all my math is correct. It predicts that an outdoor cultivation site would produce 1,167 pounds per acre of canopy, and that a mixed light cultivation site would produce 5,000 pounds per acre of canopy. And I want you to focus on that, because under the current ordinance, we have a $2 per square foot tax for outdoor cultivation and mixed light, when clearly by the difference in production, that doesn't make any sense. Lake County and Humboldt County both tax more for mixed light than they do for by square foot than they do for outdoor cultivation. And finally, indoor cultivation produces about 71 pounds per 1,000 square feet. So I used our the applicant pool that we currently have and looked at those that are conditionally authorized to figure this out. And so we have about 19.1 acres of canopy for outdoor cultivation, and it looks like I did not replace the number that goes with that, but it's further on in the, sorry about that, in the slideshow as well. These are the projections for tax revenue, with the exception of the outdoor one, which is below, that we would get based on per pounds. Okay, so the outdoor would give us $1 million for if it's by weight, and $1,664,000 for per square foot. Now, so that's just actually a little bit less. But then you look at mixed light. By the per pound income is way more than the per square foot. And then the indoor is not that much difference. And then when you aggregate them all, this would be the difference based on the CDFA environmental impact report. It'd be a $66,000 difference, $66,000 difference. And that difference would be more than made up if you tax mixed light at a higher rate per square foot than you did outdoor cultivation. In Humboldt County, taxes, for example, $1 per square foot for outdoor, $2 per square foot for mixed light, and $3 per square foot for indoor. And that's actually what Lake County does as well. So it's by orders of magnitude difference in production, so they have orders of magnitude different tax rates. So the policy questions for the board are, should we revert to a canopy tax? And what would you like that tax rate to be? And I'd point out that when we're going to the voters with a tax rate, you should probably put a tax that's higher than you actually want to charge, because you need to get the voter authorization, and then you can subsequently, by resolution, reduce the tax rate. So we don't want to have to go back to the voters to change it. So let's say, for example, you did $2, $4, and $6, just as a hypothetical example. You could have that go to the voters, and then after it's passed by the voters, you could reduce it to 1, 3, 5, or any number that you wanted less. And that way, 20 years from now, some future board could go back up to the maximum level that was approved by the voters this year. So if you want to get some flexibility in the amount of the tax, you want to put down an amount and get it approved by the voters that you can live with for the indefinite future. And then the final one is I'd be requesting your authorization to work with the tax collector to clean up the assessment and appeal procedures, to clarify the role of the tax collector. And what I mean by that is that under the way it was worked before, it was essentially the planning director who assessed the tax by just transmitting the square footage of the canopy to the tax collector. She would then go ahead and collect. But notwithstanding the fact that the planning director had all the information about how much the tax should be, when we did the tax appeals, it had to be through the tax collector. So she had to sit with me through endless appeals, when she really had no input on the amount of the tax. And it just imposed upon her staff burdens that didn't make any sense. And also the current Measure C imposes a bunch of duties on her, such as promulgating regulations for the appeal process, promulgating regulations for the most efficient collection. And she's not in the business of writing regulations, she's in the business of collecting taxes. And that's what she wants to continue to do. So what I would do is put the procedures for assessment and appeal right in the ordinance so that it could just be mechanically operated going forward. The next topic of discussion is administrative enforcement. I'm behind revising 8.06 or at least 8.06.700 to conform or to take advantage of tools that the legislature has given us that we have to adopt an ordinance to do. And that's in AB 2164 passed in 2019, or passed in 2018, took effect in 2019. And it changed Government Code 53069.4, which all code enforcement officers are familiar with, because this is where our power to enforce codes comes from. That and Government Code 25845, but this is the one that allows us to assess fines. This allows us to impose immediate fines for people who are cultivating cannabis commercially without a state license. Under the old version of this government code section, you had to give someone a reasonable opportunity to correct, and there was debate across the state about how much time that should be. Most jurisdictions give 15 days, and that's what we've been doing. So code compliance could come across somebody with, an acre of illegal cannabis and say, hey, would you mind cutting this up in the next 15 days, please? When this would allow them to immediately impose fines upon discovering the unlicensed cannabis cultivation activity and really incentivize a person to wrap it up. But to the extent that the board might be concerned about that having draconian consequences to landowners who might not be personally responsible for the illegal cannabis cultivation that's going on their property, there's a relief valve in that government code section that says that if the owner is not responsible for the code section, like if it's a tenant, and your lease actually contains a provision that says you can't grow cannabis illegally here, then it would be the tenant only who is liable for the fines. Unfortunately for the property owner, if it ended up going to an abatement warrant, the property owner would get stuck with that. But at least the fines, which I anticipate would be very large, would only be the responsibility of the tenant who is growing cannabis illegally in violation of the agreement with the landlord. So I recommend at least a revision of 8.06.700 to allow for that. But I also think there are many good reasons to look at 8.06.700 in general. We had some very lively meetings in the past, with at least 3 of you were here for, on that very topic. And you can look at the current version of it online, and I think that staff has eliminated many of the concerns that both members of the public and the board had, and I won't go into all those details, but there are many reasons to revisit 8.06 to enforce, for example, the public events ordinance. We have no real way of enforcing the public events ordinance. Someone was going to do a illegal motocross rally, and all we could do is send them a letter that says, we will fine you $100 if you do this. And the motocross rally paid the $100 and went ahead. So there's many other reasons, that being one of them, to go back and look at 8.06. So the policy questions are bring 8.06 back for revision, or just come back to 8.06.700, or don't do anything. That's always an option, but I think you ought to go back and at least look at the administrative enforcement provisions as it relates to illegal cannabis cultivation. Finally, and this is going to be, we're probably going to get a lot of our comments on, is distribution, lab testing, and manufacturing. If the industry, if we want to keep this industry, and I personally think this, we have to think about and do the jobs and bring the investment in that we can do through having an industry like this. Right now, we have one competitive advantage, and that's that most other jurisdictions have bans. But the trend is across the state and nationally to decriminalize and to regulate. So as that happens and other jurisdictions open up, growers and other cannabis business people will move to jurisdictions where there's more infrastructure, better facilities, better access to urban markets, and access to freeways, railroads, and other transportation hubs. I think without having a vertically integrated industry, we're not going to have these businesses take root here and keep the jobs here that would be created by this industry. Now, we did a fee study on Chapter 9.22 to determine how many CBCBs we'd have to issue for workers. And based on the economic impact studies that we reviewed, we're talking about thousands of jobs. To put that in perspective, the Calaveras Concrete only had 400 employees at its height. So this is would be a massive economic engine for the county, and without vertical integration of the industry, I don't think it'll stay. We'll have people come here, set up their grow shops, and then in a couple of years they'll leave. Because they'll just be able to go to Kern County and be able to have a 100-acre farm on the side of Highway 5. I think that adopting an ordinance to authorize local registrants or applicants to apply for these state license types through the Bureau of Cannabis Control and the Department of Public Health is advisable if the industry is going to remain here. So, and there's a lot of ways to do that. The simplest and quickest would be to enact a short standalone ordinance that would provide local authorization to registrants or applicants to just go ahead and apply for those license types, assuming they could be, the activity could occur within structures and in zones that already allow lab testing, manufacturing, and distribution. Because there's nothing against no rule against having a lab or manufacturing here in this county, and there's no rule against having a distribution hub here. And they would just have to do it in a zone and in a building that is suitable for such activities. It could be done through a registration program. The board could select zones that it wants to put it in and work with the planning director to come up with a plan for that. My sense is that it would only be in M zones, but it would be up to you, the board, to decide that. And whatever other additional restrictions the board wanted to impose, such as odor control and setback requirements, in addition to those that are already required by state law, or whatever other conditions and requirements you wanted to have, you could have. But since these license types really are a function of building code and fire code compliance and getting local authorization to apply for a state license, they wouldn't require an apparatus other than having them register with the county so that we know when we get an email from the BCC and the California Department of Public Health that this is who they are and that they have sought local authorization to apply for this license type. We make sure the buildings were suitable for such activities, and then send the email back to the state agency saying that, that they are authorized to apply for such a license. So the policy questions are, does the board want to see an implemented and fully integrated industry? Would the board like that to take the form of a standalone ordinance covering BCC and CDPH regulated license types? Those are the manufacturing and everything from making cookies to making hash oil, and the BCC licenses are distribution and storefronts. And then apart from that, I imagine that each of you have your own ideas about what you'd like to see changed in the ordinance. Have heard from your own constituents about things that you'd like to see, and I'm happy to address those concerns do that now, or if the chair so decides after we've received public comment. So if there's issues that you want to raise that we'd like to address now, we can, whatever the chair would like.
My feeling is I'll ask for board questions or comments at this point. I want to go to the public, and we're going to have to come back to each of the policy questions that you've presented. So if the board wants to talk now or wait until that policy issue comes up, and keep your questions at the moment generals, whatever your choice is, because we'll have to come back to it anyway.
Madam
Mr.
Chair,
President,
I got a pressing thing. Can I just have a 5-minute break real quick?
yes,
if
we will
that's all
take a
right by
5-minute recess. Okay, I'd like to reconvene the meeting. Does the board have do any of the board members have any questions or comments they'd like to make at this time? Mr. Stopper?
I think Mr. Turner's done a very good job of going over what has been put together and finding the certain areas that we can elaborate on and, you know, move forward on. For example, the well testing, there's a certain point of feasibility within reasonability needs to be considered when we're putting things together. You know, he very well demonstrated the unreasonability of the feasibility right now with the amount of time of 1 month. Personally, there's two ways to go about this. I'm of the perception that this is unreasonable to the point that there's no other commercial business out there that we're having go through these steps. Even when it comes to the landfill and they have their monitoring wells, they don't do a 24-hour pump test. There's no place that does things like this. This is purely made up on the fly for an EIR as a suggestion that I personally think is out of the bounds of feasibility and reasonability. But he has offered a partial solution for right now. And I think personally I can go with that. I'm gonna have to think about it a little bit more in depth.
We'll be coming back to
Right.
it.
But I would lean more towards getting rid of it altogether, but that would entail a lot more in an EIR process than I think we're possibly willing to take on right now. So there's that. You know, we can get back to a majority of the other things. I think Ethan pretty well covered everything. I mean, I can hold on to my extra comments as we move forward later on after I've heard more information.
Okay. Mr. Garamendi?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I look forward to the conversation as well, and I thank Mr. Turner for his presentation. It was very thorough, and I always appreciate giving choices up there, so thank you. And I think this is timely, and even though we've had this on the books for months, it couldn't be more timely than right now. With the COVID virus going around and the national economy shutting down, we have to get prepared for how we're going to come out of this and have actually industry and jobs here in this county. And we just happen to be queued up to figure out how to do that at this very critical time. So I'm happy that we're doing this, and I think what we do here is going to have an impact on what's going to happen in this county over the next couple of years when we really are going to need good paying jobs for our people. So, thank you.
Thank you. Any other board comments or questions at this time? Okay, I'm going to now open it up to public comment. The clerk will read the comments that we've received via email before I open it up to phone calls. Madam Clerk.
Thank you. We have received 2 emails. The first, please consider postponing this item for the same reasons listed below in the email from Ethan Turner on March 16th. Item 25 should be postponed until the public can attend the meetings and participate. Many of the citizens do not have reliable internet services and would not be able to participate in an online meeting. Also, how are people to respond before hearing the presentations from staff and comments from the supervisors? True participation can only happen when attending the meeting. Thank you for your consideration. Did you want me to read the previous email from Mr. Turner that is referenced in this email?
Yeah, that'd be probably a good idea if you could just read or digest it.
Okay. The commercial cannabis study session that was scheduled for March 17th board meeting has been postponed. Please do not come to Government Center as the meetings will not be opened. Meeting rescheduled to March 24th will allow staff to come up with a better way for the public to be able to participate. After consideration of many factors, the item will be held until March 24th. Additionally, if you would wish to follow the recommendation of CDC, the president, and our local public health officials and avoid any potential crowds that might come to the meeting on the 24th, and there are particular concerns that you would like Mr. Turner to address, please feel free to send an email to co.calaveras.ca.us and put study session in the subject line.
Okay, thank you. Is
That's-
that all you've received?
No. The second email I received is from Susan Morse. As a Calaveras County resident, I request that the March 24th, 2020 Board of Supervisors meeting be postponed until the disruption of our personal lives by the coronavirus returns to normalcy, to allow me and other residents to properly consider the matters proposed by, among others, agenda item number 25. It is impossible for the public to give its opinion under the rules specified in the agenda for your consideration. Further, under the circumstances, none of the agenda items are of sufficient urgency to be classified as essential, quote unquote, under the federal, state, or local declarations. For that reason alone, the meeting must be postponed. As a second concern of mine, I have a similar request on consent agenda number 18 and 22. These should be pulled for proper discussion and public comment to be included in a future hearing. The coronavirus has created a level of anxiety and hysteria in the county that has prevented proper consideration and analysis of the agenda items generally. Certainly, the draconian restrictions on public comment demonstrates my concern. By the way, there is an obvious conflict in the instructions to the public given on agenda number 25 submittal, beginning at packet page 405 through 407, and the regular agenda dated March 24, 2020, pages 1 through 2.
Thank you. That's it? Okay, we will be taking other public comments by call. If you do receive a busy signal, please try again. Madam Clerk, do we have anyone on the line?
Not yet. Yes. You are live with the Board of Supervisors. If you would like to give your name, please do so and then begin your comments.
Tony Keith with Green Road Consulting. I'd like to make the comment from the standpoint of many of the cultivators out there that you should streamline your policies now as much as possible because you have a very complex reading of the ordinance at hand, and if you want to get folks in and operating, you need to do everything you can and within your power to streamline the requirements that these folks are facing to get them up and operational so that they can be fully producing and producing the jobs and the tax revenue necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Key.
You are live with the Board of Supervisors. If you would like to give your name, please do so and then begin your comments.
Yes, it's Vicki Rainke. Yes, I'd like to comment on the agenda item 25. One of the things that is really surprising to me is that all the changes that are being requested for this ordinance. For example, the processing. I never remember seeing anything about processing in the process up to approving the ordinance. And as you all know, I've been involved in this issue since the beginning. And as a matter of fact, on the April 16th board meeting that they discussed the future ordinance, there was a comment or other license types, distribution, nurseries, manufacturing, etc., will not be included in the regulatory ordinance. So that's what the people heard and believed when this was being put through the process. And now, all of a sudden, we're talking about testing, manufacturing, distribution. If everybody remembers that when Measure D went out and they asked people, do you want to have the cultivation industry here? They said no. And so now all of a sudden, it's just being pushed on everybody. So that's the one thing. The processing was never approved. It needs to go back through a total rewrite if that's going to happen. And the same thing with nurseries. That's been added without any discussion that I recall. The clearance badge ordinance, I would love to hear from the sheriff on that. I know they wrote that policy for a reason. So if we could hear from the sheriff, that would be great. And eliminating the February 9th deadline for the remediation. Again, the applicants had 2 years to comply with the remediation under the ban ordinance, and this should not be extended. The current ordinance passed on 10/22/19 also states that they had to have had their previous property eradicated.
You have 30 seconds left.
So anyway, we shouldn't be giving them any more time. And if they couldn't follow that law, how do you expect the future to go? And then there's other concerns which I did write into the board, so you should have a copy of it, and that was the transfer application that's never been put before the board, and also the expansion of premises, change in permits, that was never brought before the board.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Weinecke.
Would you like me to respond to this?
No,
Council?
at the end, thank you. All questions will be answered at the end of public comment.
So there are no incoming calls at the moment. Would you like to set 5 minutes?
Okay.
That would give them the opportunity to answer while we wait for the next call.
I'm going to keep the phone line open for another 5 minutes till 2:41. The line is still open. Ethan, I sent you an email.
I can't look at it.
If we want to have the sheriff.
Oh, he's listening, and, he's listening, he said, he's calling.
We have 1 minute left.
There's one call that's coming in right now.
Okay. Okay, if you can, you can.
You are live with the Board of Supervisors. If you would like to give your name, please do so and then begin your comments.
Hello, Board. This is Neil McEwen, and I'm glad that this is moving forward in a way that acknowledges what a large industry we are in this county and will be, and job providers, and how important it is that in supporting us as an industry that we are afforded the same rights in this right to farm county as agricultural production, because it is a commodity that we are producing, and we are taking care of this property and this county. So please keep that in mind. We are ag. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, Mr. McQueen. Okay, I'm going to close public comment on this issue, bring it back to Mr. Turner to answer a couple of the questions that were asked, starting mostly from Mr. Keith. It was a
Mr. Keith asked that we streamline the process as much
Right.
as possible, which we're trying.
That's just a comment.
Yeah, we're trying to get through everyone's application as quickly as we possibly can, and hopefully once we have a few more people, we'll be able to. Mrs. Renke, I believe it was, made 2 points that actually reminded me of 2 things that I should have put in my presentation. One of them is the transfer application fee and the change or enlargement fee. She pointed out that those had not come back to the board, and she's correct. Those are 2 fees that are in the ordinance that, for which no resolution has been passed by the board. She did point out that she suggested that nurseries and processors weren't contemplated in the original ordinance. They were. It's in 17.950550D2. There's a section that explains what zones those are allowed in, and that section was in both the Planning Commission version of the ordinance and the board's version of the ordinance. And as to the last comment, I didn't catch the fellow's name, McEwen.
Yeah.
His final comment had to do with determining whether or not, he said, we are ag, and that has to do with one of the policy questions that you guys are going to face.
I have asked to have the sheriff come in and just, if
He is on
can-
his way.
Okay, and answer the question on what does the sheriff think about the proposed changes on the badges.
Okay. Yeah, I texted him to try and come in the back door, not the front, so hopefully that's what he'll do, and he should be here momentarily.
Okay.
If you'd like to pass the time with any other questions that board
Yeah.
members might have about policy ideas they have, we certainly can do that.
Does the board have any policy issues they would like to put up on consideration? They might come up as we go through it.
I got one.
Got it.
You know, are we done with the public comments, or?
Yeah, public
Okay.
comments are
Waiting for Rick.
closed.
Ethan, in the, going right on you. Ethan, in some of the language that's.
Here he is.
Sheriff. Maybe I can come back to it if you want.
No, I got on my rollerblades.
Okay, Sheriff, a question came up from the public on the proposed changes that Mr. Turner's recommending for badges, and they wanted to know how you felt about that.
I didn't catch all of it. I've kind of been listening and doing a couple other things, refresh. You're talking about the badges for, bless you, for the, you don't have the virus, do you? You're talking about the badges for the workers or the badges for the owners?
I think it was just sort of an open-ended on their part, but probably mostly for the owners.
Right.
And again, Ethan and I talked about this, and because the state is requiring the background checks for the business owners, that's up to you five to decide whether you want to require that. I don't see an issue with it. They have to be background through the state prior to them getting their license through the county. I'm okay with that. Ethan brought up a good point, and the issue that we've had all along, and this goes back years, is that they have what they call straw men. And when you have somebody who lives in Pennsylvania who is going to come to Calaveras County, and yes, they're going to get a background check done through the state of California, they have to come to California to get that background check, in my understanding. And I'm guessing right now. I don't know that for a fact. So I don't know how somebody in Pennsylvania is going to come and get a business license in California without coming to the state of California. So that being said, my opinion is if they're going to come to the state of California, they should be coming to Calaveras County to roll their fingerprints, right? This is where they're going to be doing business.
So if they get their fingerprints done at the state, you also want them to have their fingerprints done?
No, but the point was, what Ethan had told me is that there's a lot of people that are going to have these businesses in Calaveras County that are business owners that do not live in the state. That's where we have a problem with straw men. There's no way for us to figure out who they are. I think that that's going to be put in check by them having to have a state background done. So I think that is the balance of power. The problem is that really the person that is the owner of that business? Again, it goes back to the straw man. I'm working for Ethan, and he tells me, hey, Rick, you go to the state of California and you put that business in your name. That's going to happen. You're not going to stop that, unfortunately. That's just part of, having a straw man in a business. with that, all of that dissertation, the bottom line is, I don't have a problem with people getting their background checks done through the state as opposed to rolling them here in the county, or if that answers your question.
Mr. Turner, is what the sheriff said's correct. Whether somebody's in Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
substitute people, we can't.
Well,
That's going to happen.
If a person is an owner of a cannabis business, and we talked about that a little bit.
All owners.
They could be a board member of a corporation that is a partnership that has a LLC here in Calaveras County, and under state laws, they would all have to be background checked. And they would have to put their names down on the owner registry, on the state application. They'd have to get an FBI, Interpol, and Cal DOJ background check. And they could roll their fingerprints for that wherever live scan vendors are. But if we have the CBCB requirement for owners, anyone who is classified as an owner would have to come here, even if they got their live scan done somewhere else, they'd still have to come here and have their CBCB picture taken. And have their CBCB badge issued to them. And it just, I don't think that we as people who live here care whether or not someone owns a business that's going to be in this county if they're never coming here. I mean, Rick, earlier I said that I felt like your concern was more with the workers than was with the owners. And I don't know if that's correct or not, but that's what I...
It is and it isn't. My concern is with people that are going to be on the site. And the way I look at it is that there's an owner that is going to be coming to this county and they're going to be going to their site. They should have a card. And it's not just for my protection, it's for code compliance. If code compliance is going out to a grow somewhere, they need to know who they're dealing with. So to me, if they're going to be in the county, they should make the effort to complete their business by having a CBC card. That being said, if that's the owners in Florida or Pennsylvania, wherever the owner is, if they don't ever plan on coming here, I agree, they do not have to have a CBC card. The purpose of the CBC cards, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that for somebody that was going to be on site doing work associated. So if they're going to be just an owner and they're not going to be on site doing work, then I don't see a need for the CBC card. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally makes sense. I just want to get it clarified, whether an owner's in Pennsylvania or Amador County and they only own, whether they own 1% or more, they're on the state, will background check all of them.
For the state, it's 20% or more.
Okay.
Or 20% or more ownership interest or management and control. And the management control can be an officer of the corporation, a board of directors, or someone who's hired to manage workers. Management control is a much broader test than the 20% interest.
Okay, fine. Mr.
Rick brought up a very good point that I've been thinking about since he started talking, because as we discussed before, you saw the most issues with employees more so than owners. But what you brought up, and it is something that I personally am willing to support, and it's a very good idea. Owners can own a business and pass the background check with the state. But if you're going to be working on the property in Calaveras County, you're going to still be required to acquire a CBCB license. That way it absolves the issue with the people that are only partial owners outside the state. And then the ones that are in our county are properly vetted. I think that's a good idea, Rick.
And again, that was the whole purpose of the CBC cards, so anybody going to that site knew who was on the site. That was all.
Absolutely. And if we start letting owners go on there without a CBCB card, Ethan, then we have an issue with us going out there and checking the employees. You know?
You don't know who they are.
We don't have a filter there. So I think we need to have a standard with the CBCB for people that are on the premises.
Okay, so owners or workers, is if they're going to be on the premises.
Right. If they're coming to Calaveras County, then to look at the site, then they have time to go get a background check.
But if they're an owner and they've already been background checked by the state, why are we being redundant and having them back?
I don't
Because of the
think,
people on the site.
I don't think they need to have the background check at that point. I have to agree with Marita Callaway. I think that they have to come to planning or to the cannabis department and get their CBC card. They've already done the background.
Agreed.
They just need to apply for the card.
Very
That's all.
good.
Okay.
That cuts down on the
Mr.
work here
Tucker.
inside the county, I believe, to a certain point.
Mr. Mills?
Yes, thank you. So let's not determine an owner to be the 20% and greater holder. Let's say any person who's the owner, even if they have 1%, if they're an owner or they're on that site for any reason, they have to have a card. And I think that's your point.
I don't think that was his point.
Well, no, I think it is. Actually, this time I do agree with Mr. Mills because it is my point. If they're on site, they need the CBCB card. It doesn't matter if they're under 20%. They're out there to do some type of work, whether it's just overseeing what's going on. That said, they aren't necessarily obligated to do a background check at all.
Right.
If they're at 1%.
I mean,
So-
my point is that, right, we're not out, if they own 1% of a company, and they're not gonna do the state background check. So what we're saying is if anybody who's on the site needs a card, whether they're worker or owner, if you're on the site, you need a card. Does
That was the
understand?
goal originally, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, the 1%, the reason for the 20%ers is that a lot of these companies are corporations who have shareholders, and we wouldn't want to have all the shareholders come to Calaveras County to get their CBCBs.
That's fine if they're not going to be on the site, but if they're going to be on the site, the sheriff's office and the code compliance needs to know who they are and that they're supposed to be there. That's the whole purpose of the CBC cards, to know who's on the site.
So Madam Chairwoman, are we going through the questions, are we answering them?
No, we're answering the public questions.
And
Well,
we're sort of working through it.
Okay,
reserve my comments
okay,
to then.
when we get to it. Is, Mr. Turner, is there anything else that, the public just really wanted to know what your thoughts were?
Okay.
And that we weren't trying to pull a fast one on you.
And that's fine. That's why I told Ethan, let me know, I'll be around.
Oh, thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Thank you for your time. Actually, you came up with a good solution to something right there on the spot.
Thank you.
So I earned my salary today?
That's up to the voters.
That's true. Is that all you need?
We don't get to make that call, Sheriff.
Yes, at this point, thank you very
Okay.
much.
What do you do tomorrow for your salary?
If you need me, text me, I'll be back.
Thank you, Rick.
Okay. I think we answered all the questions I have. Do you see any that we didn't, Mr. Turner?
I didn't write down anything else. I mean, no, I think we answered the questions that were raised by the public.
Okay. All right, let's start getting into some of the policy questions.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I have one item
Yes.
that I was about to present on. Sorry, Susan. Ethan, this is just a question as we go, before we get into the policy. In the state regulations under processing and other things, if you've got more than 20 employees, you're required to have a labor peace agreement. Other counties have taken that on. I'd be curious what your take is on that, and I'd be curious of the board whether this is something we want to require. And here's my purpose. We, as we've just discussed, are going to have a lot of owners for these companies coming from, as the Sheriff said, Pennsylvania. Most of the capital for this is going to come out of Southern California and the Bay Area. What I'm concerned about, and as I said before, is our workers here in this county. So I want as much of those profits to stay here with our local people as we can. And so I wanted to get your take on whether that's a functioning thing. They said 20, I've heard other jurisdictions are contemplating 5, how that would implement and how that would help protect our workers from, so they can earn a decent living and maybe have some benefits to go along with it. Can you address that?
Yeah, sure. Under the Business Professions Code, every single cannabis company with 20 or more employees has to have a labor peace agreement, meaning that they allow their workers to organize and form unions. Other jurisdictions have put in place such things as, the smallest I saw was the city of Pomona. They have a labor peace agreement for 5 or more employees, which seems pretty excessive. But it also, there's other jurisdictions that also have local hiring commitments. So if the board wants to give direction that we do have a labor peace agreement requirement that's smaller than that's required by the state, which is 20, we could certainly do that. If the board wants to have commitments that are in the operating restrictions that require, to the extent possible, hiring local people, those types of provisions are available in other jurisdictions for me to look at and copy. So I could certainly work on that if you want me to.
Because one of my concerns is, as the sheriff brought up, you get a straw man. So let's say you're a large distributor, integrated operator in the Bay Area. You come up here and you're going to form a separate company. You may fall outside that 20. You might have 10 people up here. So I would be open to considering, what is the right number? Is it 10 people? And then obviously, we're not going to get this in front of this cycle of applications. Perhaps when we get to renewal, we may be able to find a way to protect our workers and maintain some of the lifestyle up here.
Sure, and I don't want to make things more confusing than they already are, but if the board chose, you could have a labor peace requirement that only goes for processor license types, or that only goes to the license types under BCC. I mean, processors are the ones that are going to have the itinerant workers that come and go, and they're going to be the biggest employers.
So if if I've got an acre of canopy, I've got 3 or 4 people who are up in pull hose, do the labor. But then if they're processing on site, they'd obviously have a larger labor force during that time. Or if there's a centralized, the same thing. So
Yeah.
if we set the number at like 10, that would probably cover some flux for labor when it comes on your farm.
Yeah.
But if there's a large concentration, then you have to pay.
And, it would also cover situations where someone had a standalone company with processors. And there actually is companies in this county that have come to exist in the past where they have employees of their own that they use for processing other people's cannabis. And you can impose a labor peace agreement requirement on companies like that, or even on just processor licenses. But if you wanted to do it just across the board and to do a number like 10, that could be written in.
Okay, well, I guess that's a question for the board, whether we want to consider that.
Yeah, I mean, that's not on the table today, but
Oh,
it's something that we could deal
Actually,
with.
Everything's on the
Are
table.
you?
Rita, on the
Everything's on the
17th.
table, whatever you guys want to do.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, well, that's true, thank you. So what happens if you have 20, if Jack has 20, and then he finishes harvesting his crop, and then I need some, but I only have 6 or 7, are they unionized when they're on Jack's project and not when they're on mine?
That'll
How
be
does-
between the employees and their staff, and you can bet that there'd be shop stewards and organizers who would be watching this. And
I'm
so-
sure.
And so it would, to impose a requirement like that would change the way people do business. It would cause processor businesses to be standalone businesses in all likelihood that have a unionized workforce.
Plus, oftentimes, Rita, and as you well know, if you're going to have different labor needs at different times. So if you need an iron worker, you call the hall, and you get labor coming and going. So that might be an advantage too.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
in theory, if you had a requirement like that, there could be a union hall for processors.
There are for grape pickers.
Pardon me?
And what, there are for people in the vineyards. What's the board's pleasure? You want to consider this? Mr. Mills, would you like?
Well, I'd like to just continue that discussion a little bit, because one of the things that came up in the last urgency ordinance is how do you approve payrolls? Maybe the union concept is a way of ensuring that payrolls are met, payrolls are reported properly, and that we're not dealing with a cash society here.
Mr. Tuffanelli?
Sure. I'd like
Okay.
further discussion and go forward on it. The level, though, is one that needs a lot of discussion on as to what level you implicate this. If you are unionized, it's going to be very difficult to go work at another operation that isn't at that level. You'll be deemed a scab, and so you'll be separating, what I'm trying to say, from a higher level to a lower level if you go unionized on it. I'm not opposed to it, but I'm just saying that some of the drawbacks are there. If you put the level at 10 and this guy only has 9, he can't go to the hall and say, I need, unless he wants to unionize, have them organize and unionize at 9 or at 5 or whatever to be able to go. Otherwise, you have operations that are not union and union.
Mr. Stopper?
Gary's got some good, very, very good points. Personally, I'd be for sticking with the state level standard. If we continue talking about this, and there's a few other factors that I'd like to bring up, because it could actually help with the CBCB process for employees in the future, because the unions would help facilitate that process and get it through, and it might take a little bit of the burden off of our employees with some of the work going through here. So, I mean, there's benefits, positives and possible negatives with that.
I support the concept of doing this. I mean, in the wine industry, they contract with XYZ company who brings in people to work in the vineyards. I mean, I think as this industry matures, we could be seeing that. So I support the concept
Okay, so
of doing that.
if we could turn it into some coherent direction, we could say we need a number for a baseline for the requirement, and then so if the board wants to do 10 as a minimum for a labor peace agreement, we could do that. And is that what the board is interested in doing?
If I could propose 10, but by July 1st, 2021, so that people have a chance to get this business up and going. But I don't want to, if we put another obstacle in front of people up early, it's just going to jam up. But, you know, we have renewals that will be coming due by that time. It gives us a chance to establish. And frankly, labor and everybody else is a little busy right now.
Did you have something?
The state standard's 20.
Yeah, that's correct.
And I understand where Mr. Garamendi's going with 10, but I would push more towards the state standard. With any type of business that is small, that's running smaller than 20 per se, we have an issue with them having to uphold, and the cost of the employees that a labor negotiated contract would require them to, that's beyond what most small businesses have to uphold. And the cost to employee as opposed to the business is exponential. It's burdensome to the point of nonprofit
Copy that.
in the future. And I think that's why the state did stop at 20 when they were doing it, because they would try to push it on everyone. But small business owners across the state can bring in a majority of the time 10 employees and be able to afford it under union standards, in my opinion.
I'm inclined to agree with Ben on the 20 and the state. I think you may, on the smaller ones, you go down to 10, you're imposing some higher level of pay that could be burdensome at this point. Since we're just going forward with this, I don't know. The state, again, at 20 had some insight to it. My question is there a union, or what union do they belong to?
UFCW organizes cannabis workers.
Oh, yeah. Okay, field workers.
For one.
Yeah.
There's several that are sniffing around it.
Yeah.
But, you know,
Well, I would think the labor union.
Sorry, Gary.
I would think the laborers union is probably one of them, yeah.
If I could just follow up on that. So the 20, if we went with 20. Sorry. If we went with 20, That state's already there, so there's
Yeah,
not
I
a
didn't write
change.
it.
So that's,
Don't need to write anything.
so we don't need to write anything, but if we want to go less, we should write it.
Yeah, we have to. if we
So
want
the,
to.
so, you know, we could probably save you,
I don't have to do anything if you want to leave it at 20.
You what?
I wouldn't have to do anything if you leave it at 20.
and Ethan, this is for anything, right? Anything that's going to require a state license, so manufacturing, processing,
Yes, that's
qual
correct.
care,
Yep,
Anything in the industry.
yeah.
anything in the industry.
Mr. Mills? I know, I'm just gonna wanna ask if you wanna do, you know, half a dozen, or go with the state.
You need to stay with, if you're going to make the change, then stay with the state standard for now. If you want to adjust from that later, then adjust later, but don't try to invent a new wheel.
I agree, state, okay,
Okay,
thank you, let's move on.
You don't have to do anything.
thank you. Well, if there's no other policies that any member of the board wants to raise to possibly add or change in the ordinance, then we can move to the questions that I posed in the presentation.
Oh, I have one. Would y'all leave me alone? On medical caregivers, you know, wanting to do more than 6 plants, because the caregiver, is that something that we
That's-
should be considering?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's certainly something you could consider. In section 050 of the ordinance, it lists the allowable activities, and there's nothing prohibiting the board from allowing caregiver cultivators to be able to legally operate here. I would, however, point out that under the Business Professions Code, there's no license requirement for caregivers. And a primary caregiver can have up to 5 people they're taking care of. So you could end up having an unlicensed person, unless you craft it otherwise, cultivate a considerable amount of cannabis. If you did want to allow caregivers to do it, you could simply make requirements that would control the amount of cannabis they cultivate. And I would recommend, it's up to you, of course, that you would require them to participate in the ID program that's administered by the through Senate Bill 420 that still exists, and there's still ID cards being issued to medical cannabis patients by the Department of Health and Human Services here. You could have patients get those cards. You could limit the caregivers to 2 per grower. That would make them only be able to grow 12 plants, plus I think 6 immature per grow, something like that. Yeah, but I'd have to double check, but I think it's 6 mature, 12 immature per patient. But I'd have to double check. But you could put whatever local requirement you want, because no matter what, under state law, the local caregiver has to cultivate in conformity with the local ordinance. So if you wanted to have patients and caregivers be able to grow 12 plants, you could certainly do that. And you can impose additional requirements, like the patients have to get the ID cards, if you like.
Well, the patients have to have either the ID card or the recommendation, correct?
Yeah.
So how would that,
The way the law changed under MMRSA, it required their primary care physician to give them a prescription for cannabis, or recommendation, not prescription, rather than having all these fly-by-night doctor's offices that there were coming into existence. But there is no actual requirement under state law that you get an ID card from the Department of Health and Human Services. I called Health and Human Services back last spring when we were drafting originally, and they're still issuing cards. The number of cards has declined because everyone's just purchasing cannabis from adult use dispensaries. But they still offer the cards, and the cards go into a statewide database that can be accessed by law enforcement. So you could have a caregiver provision in 050. It wouldn't be that difficult to write. You could allow people to grow 12 plants or 18 plants or whatever you wanted. It's really up to you.
but they could be doing that, excuse me, in somebody's home.
You could put the same, since state law for caregivers requires that they cultivate in conformity with local ordinances, you could put the same restrictions that we have on commercial cannabis cultivation, which is you can't grow in common areas of apartments or common areas of any multi-residential facility, things like that. You could have it be outdoors only with the same setbacks that are required for commercial cultivation. And the difference would be that they don't have to pay for a state license or a local permit, but they would just be able to grow enough to supply the required amount of medicine for their patients.
Has this come up as an issue through your department?
Yes, there's one particular gentleman who you all know, Bill Wilson, who harps on the issue routinely, but he's not the only one I've heard it from. Yeah.
Okay. What is the thoughts of the board on this?
Ethan brings up some good points that I was gonna bring up when you brought this up, is it has to conform with the ordinance. We would have to limit it to the point where it's like, look, if someone starts growing 30 plants, they're moving to the next level. But if it's enough to supply for, one significant other, as in Bill's case, where his wife has cancer and something, that's something that is understandable. It just will have to conform within, does that also apply to zoning?
You could have it be, you could put whatever restrictions you want. The local, so we could say that it's subject to the same zoning restrictions as commercial cannabis, if you like. And then limit the total number of plants, and you can even put in a requirement that they get their ID card from the Department of Health and Human Services.
Yeah, I think if we're gonna consider it, there's gonna need to be certain standards put forward to make sure that we don't have it in dense residential areas, outdoors in high numbers.
Well, the 6-plant personal grow, which can be for any reason or no reason, adult use or medical, has 75-foot setback requirements. If you could say for more than 6, you could make it 150. And that would automatically limit the number of parcels where it could occur. And I'm just throwing out ideas here. You could do whatever you want.
Can you restate what policy question we're trying to answer is?
The policy question is, should a caregiver or a person who provides medical cannabis for patient access be able to grow more than 6 plants? And that's it. I mean, and if the board would like to say that they can grow 12, so long as they are doing it for medical reasons and have the issued card, you could do that, and you could have the same setbacks as it is for commercial cannabis, if you want to keep it simple.
And I'm just thinking that, a lot of the problems that we tried to solve with 1795, things in lots of plants and residential areas, that was our biggest headache. So suddenly, and I'm totally sympathetic to people who may need this as medicine, but, I mean, this was what got biggest uproar last time. It wasn't, it was some of the big farms, but it was also, the 30 or more plants in someone's backyard. And we have to really figure it out, because it could be open for abuse. People can figure out ways to amalgamate. I don't know, I'm cautious.
Well, yeah, I understand your caution is warranted. I mean, because if you're going to have an unlicensed person have 5 patients, and you have a 12-plant limit per patient, they could grow a lot of cannabis. And,
Yeah.
And they wouldn't be licensed, they wouldn't be getting inspected by the State Water Resources Control Board or Fish and Game or any of that, or have background checks. So you have every reason to be cautious. However, you can put the screws down however you want. You could say 12 plants only. And then there's not really much room for abuse.
I'm not really interested in revising that at this point. I'm looking at this as an economic issue for the overall county, and I feel bad for the people who are going to be left out. But I just think that's a hazardous road.
Okay?
Okay. Mr. Stopper?
I would tend to agree with Mr. Garamendi. It was one of our biggest complaints during the urgency ordinance with it being in everybody's backyard in tighter residential areas. I think we need to tread carefully when it comes to something like this.
Do you have any thoughts on this?
I have a lot of thoughts. Yeah.
I probably could answer.
I will
for
agree
you.
with Supervisor Garamendi on this item.
Mr. Mills?
I said, no residential. It's unfortunate. There's people right in my town, it's the only option they have, but it's just too tight, way too tight.
Okay, maybe we can take this up at another year.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. So if we start going through the list, the first one was, and this came from various members of the community and through board members, and it was the idea that we could somehow authorize cultivation to occur prior to the issuance of a state license if there were delays in state licensure, and my recommendation on this one was don't do it.
Okay, let me ask the board, do you have any thoughts that are different than what's being recommended? Mr. Stopper?
Actually, this is something I had brought up to Ethan, and it's not to bypass them having to go through the state. It's the state process and how they move forward right now. And I think there's probably some wiggle room here if we actually talk to the state about the late 70s permit streamlining process that was put forward, and the state's inability to move forward on certain things. But you know, it's very, and I completely concur with Mr. Turner where in the Business and Professions Code, how it's written, that, you know, it gives total room for anybody to come down on the grower having planted prior to having state licensure, including the sheriff, the DA, or whoever else were to move forward on seizing plants or prosecuting. So this is something I think we can bring up later. Right now, I don't see a clear path around it. I personally think that there needs to be something done about the state process, because that's one of the biggest holdups right now. And it's not even with Mr. Turner's example of the department he's working within being critically understaffed at this time. It's the state that's the holdup. These guys, the few people in there have done a phenomenal job.
You know, we're likely to have our first couple of state licenses get issued. There's a fella up in West Point who is very close. He's told that his annual license review could be done in April, and he'll get and he should be able to get a provisional license as soon as we issue his permit, which we haven't been able to give to him because he doesn't have a CBCB yet. But as soon as he has his CBCB, I'll be able to issue a permit. He'll be locally approved, and his CEQA compliance is underway. There should be nothing holding him up from getting a provisional license. And so,
Right.
I hope. I mean, I have been in contact with CDFA over the coronavirus issue, and they're all working from home, and I anticipate significant delays as a consequence of that. But barring that, I don't know why our people couldn't get provisional licenses.
The state process and the backup on it. And that's where it lies. You know. Beyond that, like I said, I agree with you on your take on the Business and Profession Code. It's clearly stated in there. I'm not gonna discuss this any longer. It's I'll go with your recommendation for right now.
So
We can
I'm taking
revisit
there's
it
no
later.
support for this.
Mr. Garamendi?
Yeah, I really wanted to figure out a way not to have to go through this, because as Chairman said, but we built so much of this program leaning on state programs, water resources. Other thing, I wish I could figure out how to make them move quicker, but I think, I agree with you and Ben, I don't think we could back out of it. I think we have to continue
Does
forward.
anybody want to make a change and allow it?
No.
Then barring no discussion, we're going to go with your recommendation, and maybe when you get to Sacramento, you can change it.
Yeah, we would like that.
Yeah.
Remember your roots, okay?
So he's gonna go back to Amador?
Boys are on the other side of the river.
The next set of policy questions revolved around ag designation and ag products. As I pointed out in the presentation, the While the industry seems to think, or some of them seem to think that an ag designation would help them through the regulatory process, that isn't really the case. But if there is some, if the board does want to have them be considered an ag operation, the problems really lie with our own zoning codes and our right to farm ordinance that exempts people from grading permits, which were, these sections were the grading permit sections in Title 14, 15, and 17. And then the right to farm ordinance was also in Title 14. And if you didn't want to, if you did want to make it an ag product or an ag operation, we could specifically exempt it from the grading permit exemption in Title 17. So those are the three questions. Does the board consider it important to designate cannabis as an ag product and commercial cannabis cultivation as an ag operation? And if so, well, that's the first question.
Okay, so where's the board on this? Mr. Mills?
No.
Okay,
No.
Hey,
okay. Just want to get the feel of Mr. Garamendi.
I didn't realize frankly that how these are interacting with each other. And so, I'm trying to figure out ways to make it not so onerous, but also I've had mountains cut down next to me. So I've seen the bad happen. I wouldn't like that if it was grapes either, but I'd be really hesitant to start meddling with other industries, especially ag industries.
So the question really is number one, do you want to consider it as ag? And then number two would be to eliminate the grading exemption, which is what I hear you saying.
Yes. That's where I sit. The grading exemption and the, what is it, Title 17?
Yeah,
And 17. Right.
So my question would be, what do we get by doing this?
nothing really. This has just been a large, like the caller called in, said they want to be, we're ag, remember we're ag, I've gotten lots of emails, we're ag, we want to be treated like ag. It's symbolic.
And the
But it doesn't
state,
change anything
It
for,
doesn't change anything. I mean, not really. I mean,
because we're not going to exempt it from grading because
state.
No.
well,
yeah, I mean, the belief is that somehow if you have an ag, well, actually, in other counties, Amador County used to have an ag permit exemption for ag buildings, and the ag buildings were broadly construed. They got rid of it in the 80s. Some counties still have these things. Lake County apparently still has a permit exemption for structures that are associated with agricultural operations. But in my view, those violate state law, and we don't have one here. So I really don't see any. It's symbolic. Basically, they want to be recognized as farmers and thought of as farmers. And there's this one section in Title 17 that says they're not.
and the
that's-
state says it's cannabis is an ag.
Yep, yeah, well, there's a section, and I can't remember